By 0217 local time on the 14th of July 2026, the duty officer at a Ukrainian Air Force command post outside Kyiv was staring at a radar picture that should not have existed. 34 contacts, low altitude, inbound from the northeast. Moving faster than anything the Geran family had ever moved before. Not the familiar 50 km/h crawl of a propeller drone hunting for a gap in the net. These contacts were pushing 180 km/h, some of them lower than 50 meters above the ground, so low that the return signal kept flickering against terrain clutter, vanishing for 2-3 seconds at a time, then reappearing 6 kilometers closer. The officer picked up the secure line. He had one word for the NASAMS battery commanders coming online across the western districts. Launch authority, all units. What followed over the next 87 minutes would become one of the most closely studied air defense engagements of the entire war. 34 Geran-3 drones, Russia's newest, fastest, most expensive kamikaze weapon, entered Ukrainian airspace in a single coordinated wave. The Geran-3 had been engineered from the ground up to defeat exactly the radar and intercept profile that Ukraine's Western air defense network relied on. Russian procurement planners had reportedly spent the better part of 18 months and a sum that Ukrainian intelligence estimated in the hundreds of millions of rubles specifically to break the intercept ratios that had made Ukraine's NASAMS batteries a source of quiet humiliation for Moscow. 31 of those 34 drones never reached their targets. The 3 that did hit a power substation in Kyiv's western district. Localized outages. Serious but manageable. The kind of damage Ukraine's repair crews have become brutally efficient at addressing. The other 31, 91% of the wave, were destroyed in the air. Over Ukraine, by a system Russia's engineers had specifically designed this drone to defeat. Stay with this until the end. Because the intercept number is remarkable, but the number alone does not tell you what actually happened in the air over Kyiv that night. To understand why the Geran-3 failed at the one thing it was designed to do, you have to go back further. Back to why Russia built it in the first place, what the upgrade was actually supposed to accomplish, and how Ukraine saw it coming before the first drone ever crossed the border. By the time we get there, you will understand not just what happened on the 14th of July, but why the engineers and planners on both sides of this war are already sitting down to figure out what comes next. And what comes next may be more dangerous than anything that flew that night. Let's build this from the beginning. The original Geran-2, the drone that Russia introduced into mass strikes in the autumn of 2022, was, at its core, a copy of the Iranian Shahed 136. A delta-wing glider powered by a small piston engine. Cheap, slow. Loud enough that Ukrainian civilians learned to recognize the distinctive buzzing sound and take cover before the air raid sirens even finished their first cycle. The Geran-2 flew at roughly 150 to 200 kilometers per hour at altitudes typically between 100 and 500 meters. In the early months, it was devastatingly effective. Ukraine's air defense inventory in late 2022 was a patchwork. Soviet-era systems, a handful of newer Western platforms, and nowhere near enough of either. The Geran-2 exploited every gap, but Ukraine adapted. Western systems arrived, NASAMS arrived, and over the course of 2023 and 2024, the intercept rates on Geran-2 climbed steadily. By mid-2024, Ukrainian Air Force figures, which Western analysts broadly accepted as credible within a margin of roughly 10%, showed intercept rates above 80% on mass Geran strikes. Some individual nights were higher. The drone that had once seemed unstoppable had become, in the grim arithmetic of air defense, a manageable problem. Russia noticed, and Russia responded the way it has responded to every Ukrainian adaptation in this war, by throwing money and engineering time at a counter-adaptation of its own. The Geran-3 was the result. What made the Geran-3 different was not one upgrade, it was a stack of them, each one targeting a specific weakness in Ukraine's intercept chain. First, propulsion. The Geran-3 replaced the piston engine with a small turbojet, the same category of engine that powers cruise missiles and target drones used in training exercises across NATO. The turbojet pushed cruise speed to approximately 180 kilometers per hour, with sprint capability, short bursts of higher speed during terminal approach, reportedly approaching 220. That matters because NASAMS, in its baseline configuration, calculates intercept geometry based on target velocity profiles. A drone moving 30% faster than the profile the battery's fire control software was calibrated against requires a recalculation, fractions of a second. But in an intercept window measured in single-digit seconds, fractions matter. Second, altitude. The Geran-3's flight profile was reprogrammed for ultra-low approach corridors, where the Geran-2 typically flew at 100 to 300 meters, comfortably above most terrain masking, easily tracked by ground radar. The Geran-3 was designed to hug the terrain at between 20 and 60 meters. Below the radar horizon for most fixed installations, below the engagement envelope floor for some surface-to-air missile systems. At 20 meters above the Kyiv suburbs, a drone is not flying over the city, it is flying between the apartment blocks. Third, radar cross-section reduction. Russian engineers applied a combination of radar-absorbent coating and reshaped the intake geometry of the turbojet to reduce the Geran-3's radar return signature. Independent assessments based on reported radar tracking data from Ukrainian sources suggested the Geran-3's frontal radar cross-section was approximately 30 to 40% smaller than the Geran-2. Not invisible, not close to a stealth aircraft, but meaningfully smaller, specifically sized to sit at the edge of reliable detection range for the radar types most commonly deployed in Ukraine's air defense network. The logic of the upgrade was coherent. Speed plus low altitude plus reduced signature equals a target that is harder to detect early, harder to track continuously, and harder to intercept in the compressed time window between detection and impact. Russian procurement planners, according to Ukrainian military intelligence assessments, believed the Geran-3 would restore penetration rates to 2022 levels. They expected 4 or 5 of the 34 to be intercepted. They expected 28 or 29 to get through. They were wrong by 28. Now here is where the story of the 14th of July becomes something more than a count of drones destroyed and drones that penetrated, because the 91% intercept rate was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the result of a Ukrainian adaptation effort that had been running in parallel with Russian development of the Geran-3, an effort that, based on the intercept outcome, appears to have correctly anticipated nearly every element of the Russian upgrade before the first Geran-3 ever flew in combat. The question the Ukrainian Air Force faced starting in early 2026 was specific. How do you intercept a drone you cannot reliably see until it is very close, moving faster than your fire control baseline expects, at an altitude where your standard radar geometry does not give you clean returns? The answer they built has 3 layers, and each of those layers played a direct role in what happened over Kyiv on the 14th of July. The first layer was software. NASAMS, the Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, is not a fixed architecture. It is a network system built around the AMRAAM missile, but the fire control software, the target tracking algorithms, and the engagement sequencing are updatable. That is not an accident of design. Kongsberg and Raytheon built NASAMS to be upgraded, because the threat environment it was designed to operate in was never expected to be static. Ukraine received its first NASAMS batteries in late 2022. By early 2025, with access to real operational data from hundreds of actual intercept engagements, data that no Western test range could ever replicate, Ukrainian engineers working alongside Kongsberg and Raytheon personnel had developed a substantial body of modifications to the baseline fire control package. The modifications address specifically the problem of slower, low-flying, propeller-driven drones, but the architecture of the solution, the way the software handled uncertain tracks, partial radar returns, and late detection engagements, was transferable. When intelligence on the Geran-3's specifications began reaching Ukrainian planners in early 2026, the fire control update cycle was already underway for a different reason. The Geran-3 characteristics, higher speed, lower altitude, reduced signature, were folded into the update before the drone flew its first combat mission. By the night of the 14th of July, the NASAMS batteries defending Kyiv were running fire control software that had been specifically tuned to the Geran-3's predicted velocity, altitude band, and radar return profile. The batteries were not waiting to react to a drone they had never seen before. They were waiting to engage a target they had been practicing on, in simulation, in updated engagement modeling, for months. That is the first layer. The second layer was radar placement. One of the structural vulnerabilities of a fixed air defense network defending a large city is geometry. Radar installations cannot be everywhere. They have coverage gaps, particularly at low altitude, where terrain masking, hills, buildings, tree lines, creates shadows. A drone flying at 20 meters can exploit those shadows. It can fly through a gap in radar coverage and not appear on any screen until it is inside the city boundary, with an intercept window measured in seconds rather than minutes. Ukrainian Air Force engineers addressed this by deploying what reporting from Ukrainian defense media in the spring of 2026 described as a network of mobile radar units specifically tasked to cover low-altitude approach corridors around Kyiv. The specific systems were not publicly identified in detail. Ukrainian officials referred to them broadly as networked forward coverage elements. Independent analysts examining the intercept geometry from subsequent engagement reports suggested these were likely a combination of shorter-range, low-altitude optimized radars, possibly including systems derived from the German Tremel 4D radar used with the Iris-T system, which Ukraine also operates, positioned at elevated terrain points and building rooftops in the outer ring of Kyiv's defensive perimeter. The effect was to close the radar shadow gaps that the Geran-3's low-altitude profile was designed to exploit. A drone flying at 20 meters thinking it was below the radar horizon was, in the geometry of the 14th of July, flying directly into coverage from a forward-positioned mobile unit it had no way of knowing was there. The detection ranges were shorter than ideal, but short detection still beat no detection. The NASAMS batteries got track data, and with track data, they could engage. The third layer was sequencing. 34 drones do not arrive simultaneously. They arrive in clusters and loose formations, typically staggered by 30 to 90 seconds across a front that can span tens of kilometers. The sequencing of NASAMS engagements, which batteries engage which targets, in what order, with how many missiles per engagement, is a fire control problem that becomes increasingly complex as the number of simultaneous targets rises. Run the math wrong, commit too many missiles to early targets, and you deplete your ready inventory before the trailing wave arrives. Commit too few, and individual drones penetrate before a second engagement can be set up. The updated fire control software that NASAMS was running on the 14th of July included, according to Ukrainian Air Force briefings reported in defense media, revised engagement sequencing protocols specifically designed for high-density, simultaneous multi-target scenarios against small, fast, low-flying targets. In plain language, the batteries had been told, in software, how to prioritize and pace their engagements so they would not shoot themselves dry in the first 10 minutes. The result was an intercept campaign that began generating kills within 4 minutes of first contact and sustained an intercept rate above 90% across the full 87-minute engagement window. 31 drones destroyed, 3 penetrators. Let's talk about those 3. The 3 Geran-3s that reached their target, the power substation in Kyiv's western district, did not penetrate because the defense system failed. They penetrated because of geometry and timing. Based on the reported approach track and the location of the impacts, the 3 drones that got through flew a corridor that reconstruction suggests came in from the northwest, at extremely low altitude, using a terrain feature, a river bend, and an associated low ground that runs perpendicular to the main approach corridors, to mask their approach from the forward radar coverage network. The western approach corridor had less radar depth than the northeastern and eastern corridors, which were assessed as the most likely primary approach routes based on the drone's launch point. The 3 drones that penetrated found the one gap that was harder to close. The 20 meters of altitude and the specific terrain geometry of that northwest approach gave them enough shadow to compress the intercept window below what the batteries could respond to with available missiles in position. The substation hit. Localized outage. Repair crews were on site within hours. The grid impact was contained, but 91% held. The strategic weight of that number goes beyond the count of drones destroyed that night. Understand what the Geran-3 was supposed to accomplish. This was not a routine production line drone sent in a mass strike to probe for gaps. The Geran-3 represented a directed Russian engineering effort backed by substantial procurement investment aimed specifically at breaking the intercept ratios that were making mass drone strikes an expensive failure. Each Geran-3 cost more to produce than the Geran-2. Estimates from open-source defense analysis suggested somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 times the production cost of the baseline model, depending on the source and the assumptions about turbojet unit pricing at Russian production scale. Russia launched 34 of them in a single night. That is a significant expenditure for a strike that resulted in a damaged substation and a localized power outage. The embarrassment for Russian procurement planners is concrete. The Geran-3 was the solution. This was the weapon that was supposed to restore penetration rates. The intercept data from the 14th of July says clearly that it did not. What happens now is the question that both sides are already working on. The cat and mouse cycle that has defined drone warfare in this conflict has never paused for longer than it takes for one side to complete its next adaptation. Russia will study the intercept data to the extent that its intelligence can reconstruct the engagement geometry and look for what the 3 penetrators did differently from the 31 that were destroyed. The northwest corridor, the terrain masking, the approach geometry. Those 3 Geran-3s wrote a lesson in the air over Kyiv, and Russian engineers will read it. The next iteration, whether it is a Geran-4 or a different system altogether, will attempt to replicate and systematize what those 3 accidental survivors found by luck or by partial design. Lower altitude still, if the propulsion can be made reliable at terrain-following speeds, different approach vectors to probe for other radar shadow zones, possibly increased use of electronic spoofing or jamming to complicate the fire control picture in the final seconds before intercept. Ukraine, for its part, is not waiting. The same adaptive cycle that produced the Geran-3 software update and the forward radar deployment will process the engagement data from the 14th of July and produce the next set of adjustments. The northwest corridor geometry is now known. The coverage depth in that approach sector will change. The lessons from the 3 penetrators will be as valuable to Ukraine's air defenders as the lessons from the 31 destroyed drones will be to Russia's engineers. This is the shape of the war in the air over Ukraine in July of 2026. Not a stable equilibrium, not a decisive victory by either side. A tightening competition between adaptation cycles, each one faster and more technically sophisticated than the last. The margin that separates a 91% intercept rate from a 70% intercept rate is measured in software revisions, radar placement decisions, and the speed at which each side can turn operational data into the next engineering change. For Kyiv's residents, that margin is the difference between a localized substation outage and a citywide blackout. For Russia's military planners, that margin is the difference between a weapon that justifies its procurement cost and one that does not. For the engineers on both sides, that margin is the work. The Geran-3 was Russia's round. It did not break the cycle. What Russia fields next will tell us whether the cycle can be broken at all, or whether Ukraine has built an air defense adaptation engine fast enough to stay ahead of whatever Moscow can spend its way to producing. If you want to understand this war as it unfolds, not the noise, the strategy underneath the headlines, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, so you are there the moment the next chapter breaks. Hit the bell. And one final note for the record, this report is news analysis and reconstruction of ongoing fast-moving events, built on reporting from major outlets and grounded in the facts as they are known at the time of writing. As the situation develops, details will change. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.